So we've got a new Terminator movie coming out in just over a month. So today I'm going to start a series where I'm going to review each of the Terminator movies leading up to Dark Fate. So let's talk about it. Hi, my name is Sean, and I started this channel because I was driving everyone around me crazy talking about movies way too much. If you can relate, you're probably in the right place to consider clicking that subscribe button. With that in mind, go ahead and join me down below in the comment section. Share your take on the original Terminator. This is a spoiler review, so go ahead and spoil away down below in the comment section. Let's dive into all the specifics, our favorites, our least favorites, all of that fun stuff. As we go into that, just so you know, I'm doing this series along with my good friend Cody Leach. He's also reviewing each of the Terminator movies at the exact same time as I am. You can check out his review right up over here. We actually just finished doing all the Rambo movies, and we're following immediately up with the Terminator films. Also, as I go through this, I'm going to have a playlist right up here with each of my reviews of the Terminator movie. So if you're watching in the future, you can watch the rest of my Terminator reviews right up there. With that said, let's get started talking about the good. And I'll kick things off by saying that this is one of the best genre blender films of all time. You can look at it as a horror film, as a slasher film, as an action film, as a sci-fi film. I mean, it touches on so many different genres while feeling entirely consistent from beginning to end. It does not feel like we're shifting in and out of the tone, of who's directing it, of the genre. It feels all true to itself while being so many different things. It can have the killer going around killing people in the order of the phone book. And you can have the sequences where the Terminator's cutting his eye out and it's kind of like body horror type stuff. And then it can cut straight to flashbacks or flash forwards or whatever you would call these sequences in the future that are people's memories of the war. And all of it feels consistent, and it just does an incredible job what James Cameron was able to do, just knowing exactly what he wanted this movie to feel like, and the experience for you to have so that it could go between all these genres and have great action sequences, horror sequences, sci-fi sequences. Another thing you got to talk about with this movie is just some of the best world building in any franchise out there, of just creating an absolutely captivating world and scenario, while at the time it came out, it was just set in the present time in the real world, but it hinted at this world out there that was so much bigger and more, and the consequences of the choices being made now that would lead to this future war. And then we don't experience first person, the time travel. We just have people coming to us inside of the story. So all this world building is kind of hinted at of what will happen in the future and it coming to now, which in and of itself is an interesting way to do world building inside of this story, but just creating this dread for the future. The stakes, the importance, the invention of time travel almost seems like an afterthought inside of it, even though time travel is the entire premise of the entire franchise. Of course, the robots in the future taking over the world. All of this mythology, it's captivating, it's interesting, so much so that even though this movie has extensive numbers of scenes and sequences where people sit down and tell you about the world and tell you about the rules and what's going to happen, what has happened, it's interesting. Just hearing it, because James Cameron just came up with a world that's interesting. Speaking of the world that's interesting, the story here is such a great concept for an action film, of a sci-fi film, of a time travel film. All of these different things are just really interesting the way it played out while being simple. There's so many more questions, things you can explore inside of it, but everything you need to know is pretty clearly set up. The concept that in the future robots are going to take over, humans win the war eventually, so robots send someone back in time to try and take out the person that led the resistance that was able to defeat them. I just said that off the top of my head. I didn't read that. That's just the simple concept of it. And it's such a smart, interesting concept for an action movie that leads to fantastical situations, all the things inside of it. It has kind of the hero's journey type stuff without needing to do traditional hero's journey type stuff, because John Connor isn't even born yet. And so you have all of the kind of the big payoff moments of, speaking of the character that has the hero's journey and that's the savior of the future, without needing to play through all of the tropes of Joseph Campbell's, all that. You don't have to do all that stuff, but you still get the payoff of it. Likewise, by the implication, Sarah Connor becomes this really interesting character because of her connections to her son. It's one of these stories that if I would love to come up with like the brilliance of the simplicity of it, but the depth to it that we're still making movies all of these years later because the concept, the world building are so wonderful with what they were able to do. And even inside of it, coming up with the cleverness of having Kyle Reese be John Connor's father and doing it in a way that as the movie plays out, it's moving so quickly and you're so excited with the action adventure of all of it that you don't even stop to think about the fact that like, oh, he's probably going to be the dad inside of it. You don't even think about it because you're so wrapped up in the adventure. You're along for the journey. I've never actually heard anyone address this, how big of a surprise that was back in 1984. I'd be very interesting to know if when people first watched this film sitting in the theater, if they were like, oh, wow, if their minds were blown with the reveal inside of that, or if people were kind of like, I think I know where this is going. And they didn't mind too much because it was just still a really interesting, good story. So if you happen to be old enough to have an answer to that, I would love to hear your take about that down below in the comment section. Add to that, we've got 3 different just iconic characters inside of this film and iconic performances as well. We'll kind of walk through them. You got Kyle Reese, played by Michael Biehn, as the soldier from the future, that he's not a Superman. He's not like the greatest guy out there. He's just a soldier that wants to do the right thing and kind of has the hots for Sarah Connor. So he wants to go back and meet her for all these different reasons. But one of the things that makes it so interesting is that there's nothing about him that makes him the perfect guy to battle a robot. He's just the guy that volunteered for the job, that said yes for what they were trying to do. What's interesting, if you go into the history of the making of the movie, originally Arnold was auditioning for the role of Kyle Reese, in which case Kyle Reese would be this more imposing character. In the original kind of discussion, some of the stuff that James Cameron was trying to do with the Terminator himself was to make the Terminator just kind of blend into an environment. He doesn't need to be physically imposing because he's a robot, so he can be slender, disappear into a crowd, be intimidating. So the dynamics of it actually shifted quite a bit in the kind of casting process. For a little while, O.J. Simpson was the lead candidate to play a Terminator, and one of the reasons O.J. didn't eventually get the role is because no one could buy him as a cold-blooded killer, which is a nice piece of little history on how that played out. But basically, Arnold met up for lunch with James Cameron to discuss Kyle Reese and whether he'd be cast in it. And all Arnold could do was talk about the Terminator role. And he kept talking about what you need to do if you want to do the Terminator right. And he started referencing back to the old movie, Westworld. If you don't know, Westworld was a movie back in the early 70s. And he was so excited about the concept of the Terminator, while not even wanting to play the Terminator. He was just like, James, this is what you need to do. This is what you need to do. And eventually they left the meeting. James Cameron called Arnold back and he's like, hey, man, I think you need to play the Terminator. We're going to change this deal up. And Arnold didn't want to do it for a while. He actually pushed back a little bit, and he didn't I don't want to play a thug. I don't want to play a bad guy. He doesn't have enough lines. I'm trying to move forward with my career, not backwards. And as the world, everything turns out, James Cameron, being one of the absolute greatest of the last 40 years, crafted one of the classic sci-fi action movies, and the iconic villain inside of it, the Terminator, would be the career-defining role for Arnold Schwarzenegger that he didn't want to play at first. Going back to what I mentioned before, but this changed the dynamics to it, of where even as you're watching it, Michael Biehn next to Arnold Schwarzenegger looks like an itty-bitty guy, and that just adds to just how terrifying, physically imposing the Terminator is inside of this movie. Of course, I did all the history on it, but then you do have the fact that this is the iconic Arnold role that matched what he can do well, that he can have a screen presence. He can just be on screen and just you're captivated by how enormous this human is. And without him needing to be a great thespian, he can be one of the great villains of all time. And of course, leading to everything that's kind of happened with his career because of it. But some of that goes back to while him, once again, not being like an Oscar caliber actor, doesn't mean he's an idiot. He had very distinct thoughts on how the Terminator should be played, which led to him getting cast even though he was auditioning for a different role. So all that really matters when you think the history of all it, what you're seeing on screen is kind of the brilliance of Arnold in him knowing his strengths and all of it being on screen and being brought to life by the amazing James Cameron. Other person you have to talk about here, of course, is Linda Hamilton as Sarah Connor. And one of the great female action character leads inside of a film. And so much of what makes her captivating is that beginning of the movie, like she's working as a waitress in a diner and just trying to hang out with her friends and stuff like that. And the events of this film are what transform her into the action hero. She wasn't in and of herself that person. She didn't go off to be a police officer. She didn't go off to be a soldier. She's just a girl. And through what happens here and someone using their words to speak truth to her, I love stuff like that when someone's words, in this case, Kyle Reese's words spoken to her, are just so powerful to realize something inside of her that she doesn't know that's there. She doesn't know her future. She wouldn't be thinking that way, but he's able to call that truth out of her to be so she can become the person that she needs to be so that mankind can defeat the robots. That's just powerful stuff. And you make it all the way to like the most of the movie. She's not really the hero at all until the end where she has to be and she turns into it. And then of course we go to the second movie and she's in full-blown action mode once we get to that next film. But that's three different huge iconic characters in just this one movie. A few more things to talk about with this one. One thing I love about it, rewatching it, is that the action in it is actually quite grounded. You have robots, Terminators, and you can't be killed. But at the same time, you have to like think to where this franchise has gone to now. When you look at Genesis, even look at the trailers for Dark Fate, where it turned into big blockbuster franchise world where, you know, there's a school bus flipping in the air in Terminator Genesis and you see the clips for the new one and they're hanging on the outside of planes and things like that. It's just so over the top in how much excess and trying to just let's do something new and bigger and crazier. You just go back to this movie and you've got pipe bombs that Kyle Reese cooked up in a hotel room while they're driving in a crappy little car down the road, trying to toss them and take the Terminator out. And you have Arnold just jumping on the hood of a car. Once again, going back to this behind the scenes stuff, you know, even the way they filmed it to get the smoke coming off of him, they poured acid on Arnold. Arnold is infamously not a fan of the point in time in his life where he had acid poured on top of him, but it's just practical stuff. You're really seeing a car chase with this movie as it's happening. You're watching real things happen with guns and things like that, not ridiculous spectacle sequences. So watching something like this, it's like refreshing to me to watch classic action, especially in a movie like this that has so many other great elements inside of it, where it can go from just a car chase to people shooting ray guns in the future inside of it. A couple other positives here. One thing the movie does really well is moves at a very brisk pace. Like it starts off kind of slow as we're introducing things and kind of what's going on, who's trying to do what. It's kind of the serial killer part of the movie when it was a slasher film for that first 40 minutes or so. Then it goes into action mode and it just keeps moving. So once Kyle and Sarah meet each other, we have to like pour all of this exposition, an enormous amount of information where the movie could slow down a lot as the two of them sit down and Kyle goes, here's the future and here's who your son is and here's a speech I was supposed to tell you. It could slow down, but it doesn't. What Cameron did very wisely is all of this is delivered while they're in the middle of a car chase. And they pause for a second and they're like lowering themselves down as cars are driving by in the back. So you still feel the tension of an action sequence while all of this enormous amount of world building is happening through exposition. Just such a smart way to make a movie like this. But overall, for me, I mean, this is one of the great sci-fi movies of all time. It's one of the great action movies of all time. I would make a contention that it's one of the best slasher and horror films of all time. It's just a fantastic film all around. Oh yeah, we got to talk about the bad. Unfortunately, I do have a few problems with this one. Most of them go back simply to the fact that it is a movie that's 35 years old, and for what James Cameron was going for a big sci-fi action film, he did not have the budget to make the movie that he made, in which case there's certain things about it that haven't aged well. First one we'll talk about, some of the soundtrack is a little bit goofy. When you have these sequences where it's going with this goofy kind of sounding synthesizer doing stuff, you're like, okay, that's a little bit over the top. Great. The main themes that Brad Fiedel wrote for this one show back up in the second one, but the main music that's so awesome in the second one, where it was the big budget to do it right, they're all present here. He wrote some fantastic music for the film. Just some of those action beats are very that are pretty cheesy sounding. Second one, some of the effects here don't really hold up. Like, as much as I want to be forgiving, it is an older film, and some of it it doesn't look great when you go back on it and you have a fully prosthetic Arnold head, and it's cutting between, you're seeing Arnold and then there's a head with its eye missing. It's really obvious what you're looking at. And then the third one on here is in the third act of the film. This is getting real nitpicky. I've never liked it when Sarah Connor starts screaming, "On your feet, soldier!" That's never particularly worked for me. That's it. Those are the only negatives I have for this film. They're mostly nitpicks or things just related to its budget and its age. Real quick, before I give you my final take on this one and my final score, be sure to tell me what you thought down below in the comment section. Did you love it? Did you hate it? All that fun stuff. If you hated it, why did you click on this video? And how do you hate the Terminator? That's just not, does not compute to me. Remember to check out Cody Leach's review right up over here, if I remember to put that button right up there. Also know I do have a playlist. If you're watching in the future, I'll be reviewing all the Terminator movies. It will be right up there. As I mentioned before, I absolutely love this movie. For each of the genres it's going for, it's a fantastic film, and the mix of all of them together makes for a unique experience that I think is one of the best movies ever made. It's an A overall. It's a 9.5 out of 10 on the entertainment scale, and this movie is an absolute must watch. Remember to come back next week when I'll be talking about Terminator 2 Judgment Day, another movie that I absolutely love. You can check that out at that playlist right over there if you're watching in the future. If you want the other series I just finished, the Rambo movies, those are right down there. Thank you so much for watching, and keep talking movies too much.